7 cents. The coins burn Eliza's palm, a paltry shield against the contempt radiating from Mrs. Murphy's eyes. Hope, weightless in her arms, hasn't eaten in 5 days. Please, ma'am, Eliza rasps, unaware a shadow giant in the doorway holds the key to their salvation, and his own. He color from Hope's cheeks and the strength from her tiny body. The crying had stopped yesterday, and that silence terrified Eliza more than any scream ever could. She pressed her face against the cold glass of Murphy's General Store, watching families inside, buying bread and milk like it was the easiest thing in the world. Her breath fogged the window as she whispered a prayer she'd repeated countless times since her husband died in a mining accident 3 months ago. Please, God, just help me feed my baby. The company had thrown them out of their housing the day after the funeral, saying the house was needed for working families. Working families, as if Eliza hadn't scrubbed floors and mended clothes until her fingers bled, trying to make ends meet. Her bare feet were numb from the cold morning air, and her dress, once a cheerful blue, hung in tatters around her thin frame. She had sold everything else, her wedding ring, her mother's china, even her winter coat. The 7 cents in her palm were the last remnants of a life that had crumbled like dust. Hope stirred weakly in her arms. Her small lips parted as if searching for food that wasn't there. Eliza's heart broke a little more with each shallow breath her daughter took. The bell above the store door chimed, and Eliza gathered what little courage she had left. She pushed inside, immediately feeling the weight of disapproving stares. The warmth hit her like a wall, and for a moment she almost collapsed from the relief of it. Mrs. Murphy, the store owner's wife, looked up from her ledger with cold eyes that held no sympathy. "We don't give charity here," she said before Eliza could even speak. "Hard work is what builds character, not handouts." Eliza's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Please, ma'am, my little girl hasn't eaten in 5 days. I have 7 cents. Maybe some breadcrumbs." Or her words died as Mrs. Murphy's expression hardened further. The other customers, well-dressed townspeople with full bellies and warm coats, turned to stare at the spectacle. Eliza heard their whispers cutting through the air like knives. "Look at the state of her. Shouldn't have children if you can't feed them. Probably spent her husband's money on drink." Each word was a fresh wound, but Eliza held Hope tighter and stood her ground. "I'll work for food. I can clean, so anything you need." But Mrs. Murphy shook her head firmly. "I won't enable laziness. There's always work for those willing to find it." The lie stung because Eliza had tried everywhere. No one wanted to hire a desperate woman with a sick child in tow. The store's bell chimed again, and this time the entire room seemed to shift. Even the whispers stopped. A massive shadow fell across the doorway as a man stepped inside, and Eliza had never seen anyone quite like him. He stood at least 6'4" and tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill the frame completely. His weathered hands looked like they could break steel, yet he moved with surprising gentleness. Deep lines etched his face, speaking of years spent under the harsh sun, and his gray eyes held the kind of quiet strength that made even strong men step aside. Sheriff Williams, who had been leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, suddenly straightened up. "Afternoon, Mallister," he said with a respect that hadn't been in his voice moments before. The giant man. Mallister nodded at once but said nothing. His gaze swept the room, taking in the scene with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see everything. Eliza felt his attention settle on her and Hope, and something in his expression changed. The hard lines around his eyes softened just slightly, and she saw him swallow hard as he looked at Hope's pale, motionless form. For a long moment, nobody moved. The store held its breath as this mountain of a man studied the dying child in her mother's arms. Mrs. Murphy found her voice first, perhaps emboldened by having an audience. "Now don't you go feeling sorry for her, Ethan. Some people create their own problems." But Mallister's eyes never left Hope's face. Eliza watched as his massive hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and she could have sworn she saw his jaw tremble. Sheriff Williams cleared his throat and addressed Eliza with false authority. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about what we discussed earlier. A child needs proper care, and if you can't provide it," he let the threat hang in the air. Eliza knew what he meant. The poor house would take Hope away from her, and children who went there rarely came back. Please, Eliza whispered, her voice breaking. Don't take her from me. She's all I have left. Hope's breathing grew more shallow and Eliza felt panic rising in her chest like floodwater. This was it. This was how she would fail her daughter completely. That's when Ethan Mallister stepped forward. His boots struck the wooden floor with purpose, and the sound seemed to echo through the silent store. He stopped directly in front of Mrs. Murphy, his presence commanding the room without him having to raise his voice. When he finally spoke, his words came out deep and measured like thunder rolling across distant mountains. How much for everything she needs? Mrs. Murphy blinked in surprise. What? Food, milk, medicine? Whatever it takes. His voice carried an authority that beat no argument. How much? The store owner stammered, clearly caught off guard. Well, that would be. But Ethan Mallister wasn't looking at her anymore. His storm gray eyes had fixed on Hope's pale face again, and Eliza saw something impossible happening. Tears were forming in the eyes of the hardest-looking man she had ever seen, sliding slowly down his weathered cheeks as he stared at her dying daughter. The silence in Murphy's general store stretched like a hell breath. Ethan Mallister stood there, tears still wet on his weathered cheeks, staring at Hope's lifeless form. Eliza had never seen a man cry before, especially not one who looked like he could wrestle bears with his bare hands. Something about those tears told her this stranger understood her pain in ways the judgmental townspeople never could. Mrs. Murphy finally found her voice, though it shook with uncertainty. Mr. Mallister, surely you don't mean to. But he cut her off with a look that could have frozen water. Without another word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather wallet thick with bills. Eliza's eyes widened. She hadn't seen that much money since her husband was alive. Everything, he said simply, his deep voice filling the quiet store. Milk, bread, medicine for the fever, blankets, whatever a child needs. He counted out bills onto the counter, more money than Eliza had seen in months. And don't shortchange her because you think she doesn't deserve it. Mrs. Murphy's face turned red, but she didn't dare argue. Not with Ethan Mallister. Everyone in 3 counties knew his name, though few knew his story. Eliza watched in amazement as the woman who had refused her 7 cents now scrambled to fill a basket with food, milk, and supplies. The other customers stood frozen, watching this scene unfold like they were witnessing a miracle. Sheriff Williams shifted uncomfortably. Now, Ethan, you don't want to encourage, but one look from the giant man silenced him completely. Eliza held Hope closer, afraid to hope, afraid to believe this was really happening. Men didn't just help strangers without wanting something in return. She had learned that harsh lesson many times over the past 3 months. Come, Ethan said quietly to Eliza, picking up the heavy basket like it weighed nothing. Your daughter needs to eat. His voice was gentle now, nothing like the commanding tone he'd used with Mrs. Murphy. Eliza followed him outside on unsteady legs, Hope still limp in her arms. The morning air felt different somehow, charged with possibility she didn't dare trust. He led her to a wagon hitched with 2 strong horses, then gently helped her climb up to the seat. His hands were careful, respectful, never lingering longer than necessary. Once she was settled, he reached into the basket and pulled out a small bottle of milk, still warm from that morning's milking. Try to get her to drink, he said softly. Just a little at first. Eliza's hands shook as she brought the bottle to Hope's pale lips. For a terrifying moment, her daughter didn't respond. Then, as if some deep instinct awakened, Hope's mouth moved weakly against the bottle. She managed only a few sips before exhaustion claimed her again. But those few drops were like watching someone come back from the dead. Thank you, Eliza whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to repay you for this kindness. Ethan had climbed up to the driver's seat, but he didn't take the reins immediately. Instead, he studied her with those storm-gray eyes, as if trying to solve some puzzle written in her face. My name is Ethan Mallister, he said finally, on a ranch about 10 miles from here. It's a good place, quiet and safe. Eliza nodded, still not understanding where this was leading. I'm Eliza Miller, and this is Hope. We're grateful for the food, Mr. Mallister. More than you'll ever know. Mrs. Miller, he said carefully, when was the last time your daughter had a proper meal or slept in a real bed? The questions weren't accusations, just gentle observations that cut straight to her heart. 3 months ago, when my husband died and the mine collapsed, she answered honestly. There was no point in lying to this man who had already seen her at her lowest moment. We've been living wherever we could find shelter since then. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his large hands gripping the reins without urging the horses forward. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he understood more about loss than most people. My ranch has plenty of room, good food, warm beds, safety for you both. It's no place for a child to go without meals or proper shelter. Eliza's heart began to race, but not with hope, with fear. She had heard stories about men who preyed on desperate women who offered help with hidden costs. "What would you want in return?" she asked quietly, pulling Hope closer against her chest. The question seemed to surprise him. One in return, he turned to look at her fully, and she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. Pain, deep, soul-crushing pain that mirrored her own. "Mrs. Miller, I once had a family of my own, a wife and a little girl about Hope's age." His voice grew thick with emotion. "They died in a fire 2 years ago. I couldn't save them when they needed me most. Maybe I can help save her." Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw honesty in his words. This wasn't about taking advantage. This was about a man trying to heal his own broken heart by saving someone else's child. She looked down at Hope, who had managed to take a few more sips of milk and was showing the faintest hint of color in her cheeks. "I don't understand why you'd help strangers," she said softly. "Because someone should have helped me when I needed it most," he replied simply. Then he straightened up, his voice becoming more decisive. "Mrs. Miller, your daughter is dying. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon if something doesn't change. My ranch can change that." Hope stirred slightly in her arms, and for the first time in days she opened her eyes. They were still weak and unfocused, but they were open. Eliza felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked away since the day they buried her husband. Ethan seemed to take her silence as hesitation. "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently, "but if you're willing, prepare to come with me tonight before the cold sets in and makes things worse." Eliza looked at this mysterious man who had appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers. Everything logical told her to be afraid, to question his motives, to protect herself and hope from potential danger. But as she looked down at her daughter's face, seeing the first spark of life she'd witnessed in days, she realized that the greatest danger wasn't trusting the stranger. The greatest danger was doing nothing at all. As they sat there in a wagon, surrounded by more food than Hope had seen in months, Eliza felt something she hadn't dared feel since the mine collapse took her husband. She felt hope stirring in her chest, like the first warm day after a brutal winter. Fragile, but unmistakably real. The decision came easier than Eliza expected as she watched Hope take another small sip of milk, seeing her daughter's eyes focus for the first time in days. She knew she would follow this strange man anywhere if it meant saving her child's life. "Yes," she whispered to Ethan Mallister, "we'll come with you." He simply nodded and clicked his tongue to the horses. The wagon rolled forward, carrying them away from the judgmental stares of Murphy's General Store and into the open country. Eliza had lived in the mining town her whole life, but as they traveled deeper into the mountains, she saw a landscape that took her breath away. Rolling hills covered in tall grass stretched as far as she could see, and in the distance, snow-capped peaks touched the sky like fingers reaching toward heaven. Hope dozed fitfully against her chest. But even in sleep, Eliza could see her daughter was stronger than she had been that morning. The milk was working its magic, bringing life back to her tiny body one sip at a time. Ethan drove in comfortable silence, occasionally glancing over to check on them, but never pressing for conversation. Something about his quiet presence made Eliza feel safer than she had in months. After nearly 2 hours of travel, Ethan pointed ahead to a valley nestled between two hills. "There," he said simply, "home." Eliza squinted against the afternoon sun and felt her heart skip a beat. The ranch house wasn't a rough cabin she had expected. It was a real home, 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch and fresh paint on the shutters. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the whole place had the look of somewhere people had been happy. But as they drew closer, Eliza began to notice things that made her stomach tighten with a mixture of sadness and understanding. In the front yard, almost hidden by tall grass, sat a small wooden swing. The ropes were frayed from weather, and no child had used it in a very long time. Scattered throughout the garden were toys that had once been bright and cheerful, but were now faded by seasons of sun and rain. A child's rocking horse stood on the porch, its paint peeling, waiting for little hands that would never come. Ethan saw her looking, and his jaw tightened. "I couldn't bring myself to put them away," he said quietly. "Mary always said the house should look lived in." His voice caught slightly on his wife's name, and Eliza understood that even after 2 years the wounds were still fresh. He helped her down from the wagon with the same careful gentleness he had shown all day, then led them up the porch steps. The front door was solid oak, carved with flowers that spoke of a woman's loving touch. Ethan pushed it open and stepped back to let them enter first, like he was afraid to intrude on the home he had shared with ghosts. The inside of the house made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but it felt frozen in time, like a photograph of a life that had stopped suddenly. In the kitchen, a small table was set for 3 people, the plates covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested they had been waiting for a family dinner that never came. Children's books were stacked neatly on a shelf, and on the mantel above the fireplace sat a family portrait that made Eliza's heart break. The woman in the picture had kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding a little girl who looked to be about 5 years old. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's delicate features, and both she and her mother looked at the camera with the confidence of people who believed they had all the time in the world. Ethan stood behind them in the portrait, his hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder, and his face held a happiness that was completely absent now. "Mary and Lucy," he said softly, following her gaze to the portrait. "They died in a fire 2 years ago. I couldn't do anything to save them." His voice was barely a whisperer, heavy with guilt that no amount of time seemed to ease. Eliza shifted hope in her arms and reached out to touch his sleeve gently. "I'm sorry," she said simply. There were no words that could take away that kind of pain, but she understood it better than most. The sudden, devastating loss of everything that mattered was something they both carried. Ethan cleared his throat and seemed to shake himself back to the present. "You must be tired," he said, his voice stronger now. "Let me show you where you can rest." He led them upstairs to a guest room that was clearly meant for visitors, with a comfortable bed and clean linens. The room across the hall was— He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but Eliza understood. Lucy's room remained untouched, another shrine to a life cut short. That evening, Ethan prepared a simple meal of soup and fresh bread. Eliza marveled at how gently such large hands could work, cutting vegetables and stirring the pot with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to care for himself. Hope managed to eat a few spoonfuls of broth, and for the first time in days she spoke. "It's good, Mama," she whispered, her small voice barely audible, but strong enough to bring tears to Eliza's eyes. After dinner, as Hope dozed by the fireplace, Ethan disappeared into another room and returned with something in his hands. Eliza watched in amazement as he sat down with a piece of wood and a small knife, his massive fingers working with surprising delicacy. Slowly, a shape began to emerge from the wood, smooth curves that looked like they might become arms and legs. "What are you making?" Eliza asked softly, not wanting to wake Hope. Ethan glanced at her sleeping daughter, and something in his expression softened. "A doll?" he said simply. "Every little girl should have a doll." Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes at the kindness of this gesture, but also at the pain behind it. She wondered if he had carved toys for Lucy, if his hands remembered the joy of creating something beautiful for a child to love. As the fire burned low and Hope slept peacefully for the first time in months, Eliza found herself studying this complicated man who had saved them. He was clearly wealthy enough to live comfortably, yet he spent his evenings alone, carving toys for a stranger's child. He had opened his home to them without question, asking nothing in return except the chance to help someone he couldn't save 2 years ago. But as she watched the firelight play across his weathered features, Eliza realized something that made her pulse quicken with a mixture of hope and terror. This wasn't just about saving Hope anymore. Somehow, in the space of a single day, Ethan Mallister had begun to save her too, and that realization scared her more than all the hungry nights and cold mornings ever had. Just as she was settling into the first real peace she had known in months, The sound of approaching horses shattered the quiet evening air. Ethan's head snapped up, his body tensing like a wild animal sensing danger. Through the window, Eliza could see torches bobbing in the darkness, moving steadily toward the house. "Stay here," Ethan said grimly, rising to his feet. "Keep Hope close." But as the riders drew closer, Eliza could hear angry voices calling out across the night air as she realized with growing dread that their peaceful sanctuary was about to be invaded by the same judgment they had tried to escape. The torches grew brighter as they approached the house, and Eliza could now make out the faces of the riders. Sheriff Williams led the group, looking uncomfortable but determined. Behind him rode Mrs. Murphy from the general store, along with 3 other women from the church committee. Their faces were set with the righteous anger of people convinced they were doing God's work. Even as they prepared to destroy an innocent family's happiness, Ethan stepped onto the porch, his massive frame filling the doorway behind Eliza and Hope. His presence was calm but unmistakably protective, like a mountain that wouldn't be moved by any storm. "Evening, Sheriff," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the yard with steady authority. "What brings you out so late?" Sheriff Williams dismounted, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Ethan, you know why we're here. There's been talk in town about your arrangement with this woman." He gestured toward Eliza, who instinctively pulled Hope closer. "Folks are concerned about the child's welfare." Mrs. Murphy climbed down from her horse with less grace, her face twisted with the kind of moral outrage that had nothing to do with actual morality. "It's a scandal. Ethan Mallister, and you know it. An unmarried woman living under your roof. What kind of example does that set for the children in our community? The kind that saves a child's life?" Ethan replied evenly, though Eliza could see his hands clenching at his sides. "Hope was starving in the streets while your community turned its back on her. I want to apologize for offering shelter to a family in need." One of the other women, a sharp-faced lady Eliza recognized from the church, stepped forward with a leather folder in her hands. "We have legal papers here signed by Judge Morrison. This situation is morally inappropriate, and we have the authority to remove the child from this den of sin until proper arrangements can be made." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, you can't take her. She's my daughter. She's finally getting better. Finally safe." Hope, sensing her mother's distress, began to cry softly, the sound cutting through the night air like a knife. "Mrs. Miller," the sheriff said, his voice gentler, but no less firm, "we're not the enemy here. We're thinking of the child's best interests. This arrangement isn't proper for a young girl. People will talk, and that talk will follow her for the rest of her life." Ethan took a step forward, and even the sheriff instinctively backed away. "Let them talk," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "While they're talking, Hope is eating regular meals, sleeping in a warm bed, and laughing for the first time in months. Which matters more, their gossip or her life?" Mrs. Murphy's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare lecture us about morality, Ethan Mallister. We all know what happened to your first family. Maybe if you'd been a better husband and father, they'd still be alive. Now you think you can replace them with some beggar woman and her brat." The words hit Ethan like physical blows, and Eliza saw him stagger slightly. The cruel accusation that he was somehow responsible for Mary and Lucy's deaths was the one weapon that could cut through his strength. Eliza felt fury rise in her chest, hot and protective. This man had saved their lives, opened his heart and home to strangers, and these people were trying to destroy him for it. "How dare you," Eliza said, her voice shaking with rage. "Ethan Mallister is the kindest, most generous man I've ever met. He saved my daughter's life when your so-called Christian community left us to die in the streets. If anyone should be ashamed, it's all of you." But the damage was done. Ethan had withdrawn into himself, the old guilt and pain washing over his features like a tide. Eliza could see him beginning to doubt, beginning to wonder if maybe the townspeople were right, if his presence in their lives was causing more harm than good. Hope tugged on Ethan's coat sleeve with her small hand. "Big man," she said softly, using the name she'd given him that first day. "Don't let them take me away. I like it here. You make Mama smile again." Her innocent words carried more weight than all the adults' arguments combined. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, glancing between the legal papers and the small family huddled on the porch. "Look, Ethan, nobody wants to hurt anyone here. But this situation can't continue as it is. If you want to help them, there are proper ways to do it. Foster arrangements, charitable organizations, all of which would separate a mother from her child. Ethan said quietly, some of his strength returning as he looked down at Hope. Tell me, Sheriff, what's more important, following your rules or keeping a family together? Mrs. Murphy stepped forward again, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Ethan, dear, we understand you're trying to help, but this isn't the way. What will people think? What will they say about your reputation? You're one of the most respected ranchers in 3 counties. Don't throw that away for this. Eliza felt something crack inside her chest. She could see Ethan wavering, could see him weighing his reputation against their safety, and she realized with crushing clarity that she couldn't ask him to sacrifice everything for them. She couldn't be the reason this good man lost the respect he'd spent years building. Maybe, she began quietly, her voice barely audible. Maybe they're right. Maybe we should go. Ethan's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with something that looked like panic. Eliza, no. You can't go back to the streets. Hope won't survive it. But I can't destroy your life either, she replied, tears streaming down her face. You've done so much for us already. I won't let my presence ruin everything you've worked for. The sheriff sensed an opportunity and pressed forward. Mrs. Miller were not heartless. There are charitable organizations that can help you, proper places where you and your daughter can receive assistance without compromising anyone's reputation. Hope began crying harder, clinging to Ethan's leg with desperate strength. No, Mama, please. I don't want to go. Big man, don't let them take us. Her small voice broke something in all of them. Even the stern-faced church women shifted uncomfortably. Ethan knelt down to Hope's level, his weathered hands gentle as he wiped her tears. Hey there, little one. Remember what I told you about the horses? Sometimes they get scared of thunder, but they're still safe in the barn. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to keep the people they love safe. Eliza felt her heart breaking as she watched this tender moment. She could see Ethan struggling with his own demons, trying to balance his desire to protect them against the very real social pressure he was facing. The townspeople watched in silence, perhaps finally understanding that they weren't just breaking up an inappropriate arrangement. They were destroying a family that had found love in the midst of loss. Then Ethan Mallister stood up, his full height towering over everyone in the yard. When he spoke, his voice carried across the night air with the kind of authority that came from a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Sheriff, he said clearly, I appreciate your concern for propriety and reputation, but I have something to tell you in the entire town. He paused, looking directly at Eliza, with eyes that held a determination she had never seen before. Eliza Miller isn't my kept woman or some charitable case I'm housing out of pity. The silence stretched taut as everyone waited for his next words. Eliza felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Ethan took her hand in his massive, gentle grip. She's going to be my wife. The words hung in the night air, like thunder after lightning. She's going to be my wife. Eliza stared at Ethan in shock, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Around them, the townspeople erupted in surprised whispers and gasps. Mrs. Murphy's mouth fell open, and even Sheriff Williams looked stunned by the sudden declaration. Ethan, Eliza whispered, searching his face in the flickering torchlight. What are you doing? She couldn't tell if this was real or just another act of protection, another way to shield her and hope from the town's judgment. The thought that he might be sacrificing his freedom just to save them made her stomach twist with guilt. But Ethan wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. His storm gray eyes were fixed entirely on her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Eliza, he said quietly. His voice meant only for her, despite the audience around them. I need to talk to you alone. Sheriff Williams cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, if there's going to be a proper marriage, that changes things legally. He shuffled the papers in his hands, clearly uncertain how to proceed. The church women huddled together, whispering furiously among themselves. Their carefully planned intervention had just taken a turn nobody expected. Give us a few minutes, Ethan said to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. We'll have your answer shortly. He gently took Eliza's arm and guided her toward the house, Hope still clinging to his other hand. They stepped inside, leaving the townspeople milling around uncertainly in the yard. Once the door closed behind them, Eliza felt her composure crumble. "Ethan, you can't marry me just to keep them quiet. That's not fair to either of us." Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at this man who had already given them so much. "I won't let you sacrifice your whole life for us." Ethan set Hope down gently, and she immediately curled up in his big chair by the fireplace, exhausted by the evening's drama. Then he turned back to Eliza, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to cup her face. "Eliza," he said softly, "look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, and what she saw there made her knees weak. It wasn't pity or obligation, or even protective instinct. It was love, pure and simple, shining in his eyes like sunrise after the darkest night. "I'm not proposing to save you from them," he said quietly, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "I'm proposing because somewhere between watching Hope take her first sip of milk and seeing you defend me against Mrs. Murphy's cruel words, I realized something. I love you, Eliza Miller, not your gratitude, not your need, not because you remind me of what I lost. I love you for who you are." Eliza's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. "But Ethan, we barely know each other. It's only been a few days." "Sometimes that's all it takes," he replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I knew Mary for 2 years before I proposed, and I loved her deeply. But what I feel for you, it's different. It's like coming home after being lost in the wilderness. You and Hope brought life back into this house, back into me. I was just existing before you came. Now I'm living again." Eliza felt her walls crumbling, all the defenses she'd built around her heart since her husband died. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if something happens? What if I lose you two? I don't think I could survive that kind of pain again." Ethan pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her like a fortress against all the world's cruelty. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "After losing Mary and Lucy, I never thought I'd risk loving someone again. But Hope was dying in your arms that first day. And something in me couldn't let that happen. And every day since then, watching you love her so fiercely, watching you find reasons to smile again. Eliza, you saved me as much as I saved you." From the chair, Hope's sleepy voice piped up. "Mama, big man makes you happy. I can tell because you sing when you cook now, like before Papa went to heaven." Her innocent observation cut straight to the heart of the matter, the simple wisdom of a child seeing truth that adults often missed. Eliza looked at this little girl who had endured so much, who had found safety and joy in this gentle giant's care. Then she looked back at Ethan, seeing past his weathered exterior to the tender heart that had opened itself to them, despite every reason to stay closed. "If I say yes," she whispered, "it has to be real, not just protection from gossip or a way to keep Hope safe. I need to know that you want me, not just the idea of having a family again." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that looked like it had been waiting there for some time. Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond, beautiful in its understated elegance. "This was my mother's ring," he said softly. "I've been carrying it around for 3 days, trying to work up the courage to ask you properly. Not because the town demanded it, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." Eliza stared at the ring, her vision blurring with tears. It wasn't his first wife's ring, she realized with relief. This wasn't about replacing what he'd lost, but about building something entirely new. "Eliza Miller," Ethan said, dropping to one knee right there in his living room, with Hope watching sleepily from the chair and angry voices still murmuring outside. "Will you marry me? Will you let me love you and Hope for the rest of my life? Will you help me turn this house back into a home?" The question hung between them, loaded with hope and fear, and the promise of a future neither had dared to dream. Outside, Eliza could hear Mrs. Murphy's strident voice demanding answers, demanding to know what was taking so long. But inside this warm room, with firelight dancing across Ethan's earnest face and Hope's trusting eyes watching them both, the rest of the world felt very far away. Eliza looked at the man kneeling before her, this gentle giant who had saved them from starvation and shown them what love could look like when it was freely given. She thought of her first husband gone too soon and felt his blessing like a warm breeze across her heart. He would want her to be happy, want Hope to have a father who would love and protect her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, strong enough for Hope to hear. "Yes, Ethan Mallister, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger with hands that shook with joy, then stood and kissed her gently, sealing the promise they had just made. Hope clapped her small hands together, giggling with delight. And for a moment, their little family existed in perfect happiness. But as they prepared to face the crowd outside to announce their engagement and start planning a future together, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered their peace once again. Through the window, Eliza saw a lone rider approaching fast, and something about his silhouette in the moonlight made her blood run cold. It was a man she had hoped never to see again. Someone who had the legal right to destroy everything they had just promised each other. Hope's uncle, her late husband's brother, had finally come to claim his niece. The rider dismounted with the confident swagger of a man who believed he held all the power. Thomas Miller, Eliza's late husband's brother, strode toward the porch with legal papers clutched in his fist. He was a thin, sharp-faced man with cold eyes that had never held warmth for Eliza or Hope. Behind him, the townspeople watched in stunned silence as this new drama unfolded. "Eliza," Thomas called out, his voice cutting through the night air. "I've come for the girl. As Hope's blood relative, I have the legal right to raise her properly." He waved the papers in the air like a weapon, not in some scandalous arrangement with a stranger. Eliza felt Ethan tense beside her, his protective instincts flaring, but she stepped forward first. No longer the desperate woman who had counted 7 sins was shaking hands. "Thomas," she said firmly, "Hope is my daughter. She stays with me." "Does she?" Thomas sneered, climbing the porch steps uninvited. "A woman living in sin with a man she barely knows. What kind of mother puts her child in such a situation?" His gaze fell on Hope, who had pressed herself against Ethan's leg, clearly frightened by this stranger's harsh voice. Hope looked up at Thomas with wide, fearful eyes, then turned to Ethan. "Big man," she whispered. "I don't want to go with him. He's mean." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "The child doesn't know what's best for her. I'm her uncle, her proper guardian, now that her father is dead." He held out his hand toward Hope. "Come along, child. I have a wife who will teach you proper behavior." But Hope shrank back, shaking her head violently. "No, I want to stay with Mama and Papa Ethan." Her small voice carried across the yard, and even some of the townspeople shifted uncomfortably at the sight of a terrified child being forced from the only safety she knew. Ethan stepped forward, his massive frame blocking Thomas from reaching Hope. "The child has made her choice clear," he said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "She's happy here, healthy, loved. What more could you want for her?" "I want her raised properly, not by some woman who," Thomas began, but Sheriff Williams interrupted him. "Thomas," the sheriff said slowly, "I've been watching the situation unfold all evening. That little girl has been through hell and back. Look at her now. She's healthy. She's laughing. She's clearly attached to these people. Sometimes the law needs to consider what's truly best for the child." Mrs. Murphy surprisingly stepped forward from the crowd. Her earlier moral outrage had been replaced by something softer as she watched Hope cling to Ethan. "Thomas Miller," she said firmly, "I've seen that child starving in the streets while you were nowhere to be found. Where were you when she needed family then?" Thomas's confidence wavered as he realized the crowd wasn't supporting him as he'd expected. "I didn't know about their situation until recently, but we did," Ethan said quietly. "We were here when she needed us. We fed her, sheltered her, loved her. That makes us her family in every way that matters." Hope tugged on Ethan's coat and looked up at him with absolute trust. "You're my papa now, right? You won't let him take me." Ethan knelt down to Hope's level, his weathered face gentle. "Hope, sweetheart, you're part of our family now. Nothing and nobody will ever change that." He looked up at Thomas, then at the sheriff. "This child has a mother who loves her and will soon have a stepfather who would die before letting harm come to her. We're getting married next week. This will be Hope's legal home? Sheriff Williams nodded slowly. Thomas, the child is clearly thriving here. With a proper marriage taking place, all legal concerns are addressed. I can in good conscience remove a happy, healthy child from a loving home. Thomas's face twisted with fury, but he could see he had lost. The townspeople, the sheriff, even his legal papers meant nothing against the obvious love between this makeshift family. He crumbled the documents in his fist. This isn't over, he muttered, but his threat sounded hollow. Yes, Eliza said firmly. It is. She took Ethan's hand, her engagement ring catching the torchlight. Hope has chosen her family. We've chosen each other. That's all that matters. As Thomas rode away in defeat and the townspeople began to disperse, some offering congratulations on the engagement, Ethan and Eliza stood on their porch with Hope between them. The crisis had passed and her little family was finally truly safe. 3 months later, Eliza stood at the kitchen window of what was now fully her home, watching Ethan teach Hope to ride her new pony. Her hand rested on her growing belly with her second child was already beginning to show. Hope's laughter rang across the meadow, pure and joyful. The sound of a child who knew she was completely loved. The woman who had once counted 7 cents with desperate shaking hands now counted blessings that seemed infinite. She had learned that sometimes the most dangerous choice, trusting a stranger's kindness, becomes the very thing that saves your life. And as Hope called out, "Look, Mama, look at me ride," Eliza smiled, knowing that their story had found its perfect ending. They were home,